all winter terminated. And because they're winter terminated, we want to have as much biomass, right, going into the winter as possible. Otherwise, by the next spring, there's nothing left there. And the goal of the cover crop really is to also protect the soil over the winter. So making sure we're getting the corn off early is still important, even though we're interseeding. We did end up including winter rye and in some areas vetch, maybe all the areas, into the mix in 2021, because again, we're just still seeing a lot of brown fields, and I don't know, Jeff and I didn't like that. We thought that even if some of the species were winter terminated, having a little bit of green growing cover crop out there would be a really good thing. Okay, so we also wanted to lower the corn seeding rate, which we did. Again, trying to just make a little more room for sunlight to hit the ground, get the cover crop to germinate and grow a little bit more than if we're planting really, really densely. And then probably the most key thing was modifying the herbicide program. I mean, clearly we're trying to kill things that are growing in the corn. And what we don't want to do is kill the cover crop that we want growing in the corn, correct? So we have to make sure whatever herbicide program we're using can control weeds, but not kill the cover crop. You know, and it's a balancing act, and trying to get people on board with that, not just, you know, farmers, but more so the people that are out there spraying, and making sure that we all understand if we want to be successful with interseeding cover crops, there are certain herbicides that we shouldn't be spraying if we want the cover crops to grow. So the goal again was to modify the herbicide program and get the cover crop to grow, but also kill the weeds. And, you know, we'll show you that it was fairly successful. So again, our biggest issue across both years was it was really dry. And it wasn't just dry for a portion of the season. In both years, you know, 2020 and 2021 for this is in Alberg, was even worse. And I think, you know, everybody got their own weather report with their specific data, and some locations were far worse than others, you know, as far as precipitation. And you'll note that when Lindsay put the reports together, you know, we're counting precipitation often into September and October, and I think we all know, like, it's a little late sometimes by that point in the season. So we just, you know, we didn't have enough moisture, and that really hurt the cover crops. And, you know, in some cases it really hurt the corn too, but it definitely kept the cover crops from being as successful as they could have been. And that was a bummer for us, because you could go out there and see things growing early on, but without the moisture, you know, a lot of fields just didn't amount to much, which was unfortunate. So when we looked at weed control in the fields, the yellow bars here are weeds and the green bars are cover crop. So you can see that the weed control in the control fields versus the trial fields was about the same for most locations, right? So there were some locations that had horrible weed control with our system. And there were some locations that had horrible weed control with their own system. So, you know, I think this really goes, you know, says a lot about making sure that the fields that we do select for interseeding and using a lower residual herbicide, you know, it just really needs to be considered. We clearly shouldn't be going into a field that has some significant weed issues that are going to require long residual herbicides and trying to use a low residual herbicide. So there needs to be clearly some foresight around fields that are selected for interseeding in regards to weed control. But overall, in the majority of the cases, the low impact or low residual herbicide worked really, really well. And it was also relatively low cost, although that definitely probably will change this year. All right. And then as far as the cover crop composition goes, having the diversity was good. You know, we often think that we want more diverse mixtures of cover crops because we want to benefit from the different types of plants growing there and the things that they can do, you know, whether it's a tillage radish, breaking up compaction, or clover, making nitrogen. But the other thing, you know, putting that diversity out there does is it generally makes sure that something does well, you know, given the year or the soil type. And, you know, we saw that in both years. So you can see in 2020, in most fields, the radish was predominant, but the ryegrass also did fairly well. And if you compare this to your own data, you may find on your farm the radish did well in one year, but the ryegrass did better in another year. And you never know, right? You never know what the year is going to bring. So having that diversity can also hedge your risk in making sure something grows. So I think that was a take-home message for us. But overall, you know, the radish and the ryegrass seem to do the best, you know, in regards to interseeding. We never really got much clover growing. You know, each field was a little bit different. The winter rye seemed almost non-existent last year. It'll be interesting what we see when we go out this spring, and the vetch as well. And again, they're larger seeds. They may, you know, have been more impacted by moisture than some of the other species. Okay, let's see here. So Lindsay, I didn't get your new pretty slide in here, so I apologize. But I mean, we are still seeing lots of variation around the amount of cover crop that we are getting. And you can see on the bottom, here's 1,000 pounds of dry matter, which is a lot. That's a lot of cover crop. It's not a little amount. So, you know, on average, I think we are around 500 pounds of dry matter. And again, that's not horrible. That's actually pretty good if it was winter rye. But, you know, many of these cover crops, again, they die over the winter. So you want to have a lot of biomass out there in the fall. So when they do die, you still have residue on the soil to protect it from erosion. And to get that kind of protection, we really need over 1,000 pounds of dry matter if it's going to be winter killed. So, you know, you can see in some cases we had almost 3 tons of dry matter. And in other cases, you know, we didn't really have much at all. So still a lot of variation out there in the success of interseeding. And a lot of this in the analysis that Savannah Crossman has done for us, and Alyssa can probably speak to this better than I can. You know, the biggest driver of success in most cases was moisture. Is that right, Alyssa? I remember you telling us that at one of our meetings.
Yeah, that's right. A little out of our control, more than we'd like it to be.
Yeah. And then as far as, you know, what happened to the corn, so we did change things, right? We lowered the population. We had shorter season varieties. We were using a different herbicide. We had these skips in the rows as well. And overall, you can see that the average yields were very similar between the control and the trial field. In 2020, there was, you know, almost, you know, a ton difference between the two. And in 2021, there was barely any difference at all. So in some cases, modifying the corn populations or variety did have an impact compared to what the farmer was currently doing. But for the majority of the cases, there really wasn't much difference at all. So, our take home from this was maybe we can reduce the populations more than we thought, which saves money on corn seed as well, and not sacrifice yield.
Can I jump in, Heather, just for a
Yeah.
second? I would say that from observing the fields, where the yield hits were the worst was where the spray programs were the worst. It was highly dependent on the weed pressure that the corn crop got early in the season as to the yield hit that farms took. So it was probably tied more to the herbicide program than to seed population or seed variety, I would say.
Thanks, Jeff. All right. And here's just, a graph showing all the fields and the yields, the control versus the average. So, and you guys have all this. This is, again, showing how well folks are doing with soil health in Vermont. We had just a couple of fields that, really, well, how should I say this? They weren't performing as well as everyone else's fields. That's not everybody's a winner, right? And the score, and you got your soil health test information in detail from Alyssa as well from the work that we did. And I feel like at this point, when we're looking at this group of data from you folks, I feel like all of our farms should be meeting the average here. And if you're not meeting this average, then we should be looking at what's happening, in your management on those fields so that we can get you to our average, which was almost 80%. And I keep thinking to myself, this is from the Cornell Soil Health Test. We're doing really well on their scale. I mean, almost perfect. There was one of the farms that had a score of 98 or something on their soil health test. And we kind of need to set our own benchmark instead of using Cornell's because we're doing that much better, which is something really to be proud of. And so in this, group of farms here, we have a few farms, and some of these fields, I'll say, like they hadn't been in cover crop, or maybe they weren't receiving manure. There are different production practices that were being used here that could be modified to get them into better soil health. So, congratulations to everybody. The soil health scores were phenomenal. But on the majority of the farms in this study, people have been adopting all the practices, and it's really showing in your scores. And also in the amount of organic matter in the soils, which, Alyssa, I don't know if you have those slides handy, but if you did, we could pull them up. But everybody got their own tests, so you can read all of your results, and you can also see where you scored amongst all the other farms, in the state. But really the point, again, in my mind, after thinking about this for a couple of years, is that you're already hitting a really high bar, and it's something to be proud of. And we've set our own standard, really. I feel like we have set our own baseline, and trying to achieve that average for other farms that are growing corn in this state, I think is the direction we want to go. And if our average is 80, and that's what all of you are doing, why shouldn't most other people be able to achieve that as well? And it really shows how hard all of you have worked and the benefit over time. I have been really proud to be able to share your data this data, this graph. I know a bunch of you have seen it time over and over again over the last year, because it's really actually a testament of the hard work that you have all been, putting into your farms with, on conservation. And it's pretty exciting to see the results. The thing I laugh about is that, I mean, even in some of the fields that didn't have conservation practices, they weren't in the red. And we didn't have a single farm in this project, and I don't think a single farm in our entire state of soil health study, did we, Alyssa, that scored low?
Yeah, I don't think anybody was really low. I mean, the low ones, I can look, I think maybe it was in the 60s. I'll check.
So I want to say Vermont's the best, but
We are.
yeah. Uh, and some of you, I mean, hopefully you had a chance to look at, the carbon storage in your soils. It's quite phenomenal, the amount of carbon that you folks are storing just in your cornfields. And Alyssa put together a policy brief that compared forest soils to some of these carbon storage levels, and sent that out to a colleague, and the colleague saying forest soils aren't as good as they're portrayed here. So we need to actually it sounds like we need to bring those numbers down, which then brings the crop numbers even closer in line with what we achieve in forest soils. So kudos to all of you. It's quite amazing to see what we can achieve, and how I don't know if we've achieved the highest in our cornfields, but we know that we can get higher in most of the fields. So I'll conclude this, and I know, Alyssa, I didn't ask you to talk, but if you want to show any of those total results for people, that would be great. And if not, we'll just move on to the next thing. So our conclusions is that, we can modify the corn practices without sacrificing yield. And we know that moisture is actually probably the biggest driver, one of the biggest drivers here. If we had all the stuff that we can control in the field in place, and we got moisture, we should be doing really well with our interseeded cover crops. The mixtures are really good because they hedge different types of risks in the field. Different cover crops provide different benefits, but I also feel like different cover crops hedge against other risks that we have, whether it's soil type or weather, etc. And it's really important to have, and I say this, all parties on board for this to be a success. And I'm saying that, everybody we work with in the industry, if there's, willing to and interested in making cover crops a success, we can do that, but we need everybody's buy-in. And that was the thing around this project, is that we purchased the buy-in, we paid for it basically. And so we were able to get it. And I hope that that also helped various folks realize that, if we're putting more planning, I don't want to say thought, but more planning, and I guess thought, into what the cover crops need to be successful, then they'll be more successful. All right. So, did you say anything, Alyssa, about
Yeah, I guess I wondered what you wanted me to share. I have the slides from the presentation we did last month, but I'm not sure which parts you think would be most interesting to folks. I'll just echo what Heather said. I think what we found mostly is that Vermont farmers are doing a phenomenal job at already having achieved really high soil health. How much time? Yeah.
we scheduled an hour, but we could also ask folks on the call if they had questions about their results or the state of soil health results. Most of you were just kind of rolled into that project because you were involved in this project. Look at Larry laughing. So it might be good, Alyssa, to give people that overview. They may not really have even known that they were going into this much larger data set.
Sure. Okay. Can you hear me? Am I still on mute? So yeah, the State of Soil Health Project we talked about a year ago. And essentially when Heather hired me, I was really interested in looking at soil health across the whole state and across different farming contexts. And so we just got everybody together that we knew was interested in soil health and had other projects going on. And then we got some additional funding from Ben and Jerry's and the Nature Conservancy to add some extra farms. And so we ended up going across the whole state of Vermont to measure the same indicators of soil health on 221 fields. And so this project got rolled in because you were already measuring a lot of soil health indicators. We added a couple things to what you were already measuring. And then at the end of the project, we kind of summarized the data at the state scale and then tried to share with each farmer how their field measurements compared to the rest of the state. So that's what was in that little report we shared with you. And this is just a map of where we got to. So, you know, there's a lot up here in your area from this project that contributed, but there are also a lot of fields down in Addison County. And then we got all the way down to Brattleboro and it kind of had a pretty good swath of different farms participate. And there were a lot of different partners that were involved in this. And so the things we measured, you know, were this kind of shallow portion of the soil to 15 centimeters depth. That's about 6 inches. We measured the Cornell soil health indicators, but then we also measured organic matter and bulk density to 30 centimeters depth, which is like a foot. And that's kind of the international standard for measuring soil carbon stocks. And we thought folks would be interested in looking at that. There's just so much more interest in understanding how farms are contributing to storing and sequestering carbon. So that's what we did. And the picture there on the right is the bulk density hammer that we took with us to all the fields. And then we actually have one more thing going on. So there's a researcher at Dartmouth, a graduate student who was interested in looking at kind of the different types of carbon in agricultural soils. So there's kind of a longer term type of carbon that's associated with minerals, and then there's kind of shorter cycling carbon. And so she's in the process in the lab with subsamples of all the soil, looking at kind of what portion of the carbon is in kind of this long-term mineral associated carbon versus short-term. So that'll be really interesting, and she'll hopefully share that with folks in the next couple of months. I think a nice summary is like the overall Cornell assessment of soil health score, which is kind of based on optimal levels for each of the indicators relative to the type of soil you have, because the soil kind of influences the the level of water holding capacity and some of the other indicators like the amount of organic matter that you can have in your soil. And so the scores are nice in that they kind of take that into account. And we just saw, really high levels across the board. Let's see, I think our low here, we've got 55 was the low in a vegetable field, but in cornfields, on average, 82 is really great. So we're doing a good job. And this slide has a lot in it, but I think it's nice because it shows all of the different individual scores for each of those indicators that are measured in the Cornell soil health test. And so here far on the right is like a score of 100. And this top one that's pink is the overall score, but then it kind of breaks it out into all these other different things that are included in that. So we've got the, minor elements, we've got potassium and phosphorus and pH, and then some of these biological indicators like active carbon and respiration. That bright green one is organic matter rating, which is generally pretty high, but you can see on the left, there are some folks whose fields had really low scores for organic matter, even, considering their soil texture. So we can use that to kind of identify where there's places for improvement needed. And these things that are circled in red are the things that in general, Vermont soils are really good at, right? So we have really high ratings in terms of elements and water holding capacity. It's probably a lot of clay soils and high organic matter. But then we can also use this to see kind of where there's generally more room for improvement. So we saw overall lower scores in respiration, which is just a measure of how much the microbial activity in the soil is breathing or consuming. And so it's just a measure of biology activity in the soil. And then this other one here is aggregate stability. And so the way that they measure that in the lab actually is they take a bit of soil and they put it on a sieve, and then they simulate a rainfall on it. And then they measure the amount of, or the percent of the soil aggregates that stay after the rainfall. And so that's a good measure of kind of resilience to erosion. And we see that that's like really variable and had kind of a lower average score in the state. And that's something that's improved by reducing tillage or disturbance. So that's something we can kind of see to focus on. Does anyone have like specific questions? Oh, I'm sorry, I wasn't looking at the chat, but I can see that there are some things in there. All right. Oh yeah, about the soil type. Yeah. So we can look at the individual like values, and that's interesting. But the nice thing about the Cornell test is that it takes into account soil texture. So these scores are really, really helpful to interpret what's going on. And as Heather said, it would be really interesting to maybe do this kind of calibration within the state of Vermont, just because we tend to have higher scores compared to maybe what we're seeing in New York or the region. So I guess I wonder how much time you want me to take. There's more slides here. We could talk about the biological things that we measured and like how we measure soil carbon stocks.
I'm wondering if anybody had any questions about their results, or, just interested in what, why this scored high or low. I know I was really, sometimes I was surprised when I saw high scores on certain fields that I sampled, because I didn't think they should be high, and then there were other fields. I guess we didn't really see any really low scores, but I was kind of surprised at a couple of fields that scored high. So that, that part made me wonder. I do feel like, the manure that's added to our systems inherently helps with soil health. And then when you start adding on cover crops and no-till, you start to continue to increase or improve certain aspects of soil health. But I think just by nature, because we're adding manure to the system, we are seeing, some improvements because of that. And then the only other thing was about the carbon storage, which I got really excited about, both how well some of the farms were doing, but then also how much better we could do. It really helped put into perspective how high we could potentially go. So as an example, I think the average, and I'll go back to organic matter, maybe like the average organic matter in hay fields was, oh, there we go, was over 4%. But you can see there were fields and pastures that were over 7. I think the highest one was 10% organic matter. So we know that we can achieve that, which also means that the amount of carbon that's being stored, is going to be a lot higher in that 10% organic matter field than in, that in a pasture that only has 3%. So how do we get all of our fields to 10%? And same with corn. We had cornfields that had organic matter levels. You can see those 2 dots, almost at 8 my mind is really good when I see that in cornfields. And we had some that were 7. I mean, so how do we get our other fields to 7? It really started making me think like, okay, this is achievable. How is that being achieved? And then how do we move everyone else, to that level? It was quite telling, I guess. All right. I'm asking for questions, but I don't ever shut up, so I'll shut up now.
While you're thinking of questions, I can put this is the information on the carbon stocks that Heather mentioned. We use this data from the NRCS that they gathered like 10 years ago to kind of compare what we measured to see if it was, within the right range. They only measured soil carbon on, a smaller subsample of fields, 20 or so that were in agriculture. And they also did a number in forestry. And so the average in the forest fields from that project was over 200. And in the cropland, it's 90 something, which is similar to what we found in our project. But when talking to this colleague at UVM, who's been measuring soil carbon stocks in forests for a long time, he said the average in Vermont that he's found is in the 90s. So it seems like we're doing a good job.
All right.
Okay.
Anybody, any questions or comments even? How this project has changed your life. Those are always good so that we can write them in our report. No, I'm just kidding. I know a few people have, decided maybe to reduce their corn populations because, the evidence was there that they could do that and maybe even get better yields than they were getting with higher populations. Anyway, so Larry.
Yeah, I'm not sure of all the other trials. Mine was a little different, I think, because my control was probably 20 inches and the rest were probably 30 inches. So the trial that we did last year were the wider rows, and I did 40 inches and you probably did some 60 somewheres. And Jeff actually, I think, used, I'm not sure if there's anything else besides the alfalfa. It was very poor dry conditions. That cover crop really grew well. So I'm thinking, if we can kind of like have a hybrid of the two, where you had the skips in a row and I think the population was down, and the other trial that we had, and I'd like to do it with my other planter, the one I had out there. I wasn't able to put the population down, accurately, but it did have a lot of seeds that were almost dumped on top of each other's, and they all produced ears because it had width beside it. So I'm thinking if you could get the population higher and do the rows a little wider, I think the interseeder, I think we could really come up with something that'll work. And I noticed, kind of weird, my trial results this year, it doesn't look like this much, but it, like you said, it showed more organic matter, or more not organic matter, is more plant material out there than what it really looks like. But the year prior had a lot more, but my yield was down on a trial 2 years ago. This past year, the trial was a lot higher. So it just shows that the more the silage corn shades, the less that the interseeding works. So that's just, you're at 30 inches. And I'm, for myself, I'm thinking, well, maybe 40 inches and try to get that population up. And I think the interseed is going to work really great there. So I'm that's kind of the wheels that I'm putting forward in this type of trial.
Couple of comments, Larry. I know my mic isn't working right, but number one is the clover grew tremendously on the trial field last spring. You could have mowed that clover. It was knee high when we planted, and I think you definitely got a nitrogen boost on the trial field from the clover we interseeded the year before. There wasn't a stitch of clover there in the fall, right. And in the spring it was all clover, especially the side towards the river. On that, the other thing is what we have found is that we can push the populations in the 40 and 16-inch rows and maintain a pretty reasonable level of yield if it's done right. I don't have the numbers in front of me about the yield loss, but I think at Tom Macy's, it may have only been a couple of ton to the acre, less than the 30-inch rows. And the problem that I know my in-laws chopped that, I don't know what you had on your 40-inch rows, but the 60-inch rows, the chopper didn't like to take the corn in. It was a wicked crop of corn. And the stalks were like 3.5 inches apart. And the corn head did not like it. It didn't flow good through the head. So that may be something that we have to work on in another year. But we can push the yields if you use a fixed year corn and jump the population up. You can get quite a crop of corn. So I would agree. I know you had problems with the alfalfa field, how it was planted and whatnot, but another year, I guess I'm saying this year we're doing it again. We'll have an opportunity to make some improvements there.
Yeah, I definitely agree with all those assessments. It was a higher quality corn, there's bigger ears. And just seeing that even though they were planted close, all of them were making ears. And I just think with a different planter, and then of course the environment was huge on that type of field because it was clay, and we didn't get rain for about 50 days straight just before it tasseled. But yeah, it was definitely, like you said, when you chopped it, it is harder because you got bigger ears, more kernels going through your processor, so it worked a lot harder. And it really surprised me with the tonnage. It wasn't great, but it was a lot more than what I thought we were going to get. And it's because it's more in the ear form, higher starch.
Since we were talking about these wide rows, I don't have your data here, Larry, but we did start looking at interseeding alfalfa and orchard grass. And orchard grass as the cover crop like we did at your place. So you can see to the right, there's, that's the alfalfa stand that was coming up in the corn. And in the 30-inch rows, by the end of the season, we did have the best establishment in the alfalfa plots. I don't know what it's going to look like this year. I'm curious. But when we had the 60-inch rows, it appeared that the orchard grass and the alfalfa did the best. And, we had 500 pounds almost of dry matter sitting there in the fall before we went into the winter. So it'll be interesting to see what that looks like this spring. I somewhat doubtful that you could harvest it for hay, but we'll see. That was kind of the goal, was to think about if we're going to move people to 60-inch or 40-inch rows, or suggest that they should do that. And we know in a 60-inch row, the minimum yield loss I've seen is 3 tons minimum. So 3 tons difference less between the 30 and 60-inch rows. And for some people, that might be fine. Like they don't care. The 3-ton yield loss and an awesome cover crop or an awesome forage stand established might be worth that loss. And that's, kind of what we're trying to figure out. Like, could we actually establish a forage as the cover crop in the corn? And that's kind of what we were trialing at your place, Larry, even though you didn't know it. Another one of those embedded within the trial.
Pat, you're not muted.
I don't know if Pat was trying to talk or if he accidentally unmuted himself.
Well,
but
he was, and now he may not be. I don't know. So.
Well, just to touch back on that real quick, Heather, the alfalfa that grew was tall enough that some of it, while I was chopping the corn, was going through the chopper. So, it's not out of the realm to think while you're chopping corn, you may be adding some protein also.
yeah, and I think, so let's say the alfalfa, we didn't try clover, and that might, work well too, but you know, if those fields that got the alfalfa interseeded were ones that you could terminate last in your whole planting regime, you know, or if you could plant into these the corn and terminate the alfalfa much later, you still might get some nitrogen credits, more so than, you know, the other cover crops were growing. So that's kind of what we're starting to look at this year and, you know, into the future. So just thought I'd, since you were talking about it, put that out there.
Well, that really goes into my thought process, just because the way the nitrogen market has reacted in this past year and the cost and yeah, if you can reduce the need of planting more nitrogen at a time because you get the right cover crop growing, you know, you can
Yeah.
afford to have a little bit less yield.
Yeah, I mean, the issue we had with using those really diverse cover crop mixtures in the 60-inch row was that they did grow really tall. There was a lot of biomass there, but when we chopped the corn, we chopped it all off. And I don't, you know, in that case, it didn't add anything to the quality. It could have made it worse, actually. And then we didn't have any cover crop left. We chopped it all. And, you know, sure, the roots were in the ground, but they were all annual cover crops. So then they died and the ground was bare going into the winter. So, you know, these systems, that particular system is coming out of the Midwest where they're combining corn. So having, you know, they're not chopping the cover crop off when they combine. I'll show you a picture of it. It was quite crazy.
Yeah, I was thinking
Yeah,
a little
so-
bit of a hybrid on a trial with that alfalfa. If you plant like a legume in row, and then when you harvest, maybe you can do the winter rye then, and get enough cover between the two of them, and one over winter. Maybe a combination. I don't know.
Yeah,
No, another pass, but
yeah. I mean, you can see how tall the cover crop was in those 60-inch rows. So, and that was, you know, this was well before we chopped. So when we used the lower growing cover crops, we also had a lot of biomass and most of it was left there when we got done chopping the corn. But in the case of this is like sun hemp and sunflowers and I don't know, it had all cowpeas and I mean, it probably did a lot of good below ground, but you know, we didn't have anything left on top afterwards. So different project.
Yeah.
All right, so I know we scheduled till 1:30. I'm wondering if folks have other questions or comments. Nancy,
Nancy,
you had a question.
Nancy has a question, I think, and I kind of have a bunch of stuff to go over, so I can do that. But Nancy, go ahead, unmute and ask your question.
Okay, on herbicides, we haven't had good luck with clover. We've been using multi-species cover crop seeds, so we've had the diversity and the composition of the cover crop seed. But when it comes to herbicides, are most farmers using Roundup versus a pre-emerge spray, or because and then the timing of the spray? So I know pre-emerge goes on right after planting, and then Roundup for us, it seems like it's been a little bit skewed the last couple of years, and there's been a little confusion them coming in and just spraying, and then the interest in this, I'm talking about interseeding now. I'm not talking about planting in the fall, but yeah, it just seems like did that have a big impact on it for most farmers?
So for this project, Nancy, everybody got, the trial fields were all treated the same. They got glyphosate and Resolve Q, or theoretically they did. That's what we paid for. That recommendation came out of Penn State, based on work that they had done. Now the timing of the spray was definitely a problem on on several farms where they were super busy and they were driving by, so they sprayed when they shouldn't have sprayed because there was nothing to spray. That happened to their farm, and that's definitely an issue with the amount of sprayers we have to the number of acres that need to be done. And we didn't really have control over that as well as we would have liked. But I know you weren't the only one, but I know you guys, I think you got it twice, where they came in and sprayed with nothing green in the field and then having weeds later. Timing is important. So the problem with the pre-emerge program is that depending on what chemical, we're really limited on chemicals to do the interseeding because of the residuals. And there's more work that could be done there. There's probably other options. This was the simplest, seemed to be least evasive option. You go in with a contact kill, the mode of action, the glyphosate with a very short 4-week residual with the Resolve Q. It's a very simple spray program, and so that's the choice we made. Maybe it wasn't the right choice, but that's kind of where we were at. And I think the data shows that on most farms, it did equal to better than what farmers were spraying before. So, but again, that had to do with timing. And you guys, I know you got the short end of the stick at least once on the timing part, which was more to do with the sprayer than it did to do with the herbicides that were being sprayed. So I don't know if that answers your question, but it's definitely a consideration that we need to, if you're going to use glyphosate, you've got to put it on at the right time or it does nothing. So.
Yeah, well, we got that part, but you said there was a 4-week residual with the Resolve Q.
I mean, I don't know I'm not sure exactly what the number of days is, but the Resolve Q is a very short residual, with the idea that the cover crops would get planted and then the crop would shade the soil out and the weeds wouldn't grow as much. So, I mean, that's the original intent. I'm sure somebody can look up and tell you what the residual is on that, but it is short. So it's not a full season carryover at all. So that's why we selected it. That was 2 years ago. I don't remember. I did remember. I thought it was like 4 weeks. It may even be shorter. So there's that. But I have a few things. I know we don't want to keep you. I got 5 minutes. I just want to run over a few things. First off is our UVM team would really like to thank everyone for their participation over the last 2 years. You guys did a lot of work to help make this happen, and we surely do appreciate that. So I would like to mention just a couple of issues that we had. One was actually with the interseeder. The first year, the new interseeder hadn't come, so we used the old interseeder. And the second year, we had the new interseeder, but we did have some problems with how it incorporated the seed into the soil, especially later on in the project when there was more problems with it. I didn't really see where that made any difference. It could have made a difference, but I think the dryness of the summer just overrode everything else. And so there was, it's an ongoing effort to try to get this stuff better. And I have been in contact with the manufacturer, and they are going to make changes to that machine for this year. So We also, I think we also found that growing a short season corn, it is a viable option. Again, the 2 years that we've done this, the falls have been very nice. So I'm not sure if there was an advantage of interseeding over post harvest. But for sure, certain years there will be. And we just happen to have 2 very, very dry years. One observation, I guess we'll know more in a week or so, but the winter rye, we put that down on about 50% of the fields and really didn't see that grow much at all. And it'll be interesting to see if that seed took late and what grows this spring. Not sure, but that's something we're keeping an eye on. We're doing this again. The original agreement that we had with the farmers was that we would do it for 2 years and the farmers would do it for 1 year, the 3rd year. So I don't know as if we're under any contractual, you got to pay the money back deal, but we would like to continue the work for the 3rd year with as many farmers as we can have work with us. And so we will be reaching out. We do have to sample this spring as part of finishing up last year's work. So we're going to try to get out in the fields in the next, not the next 2 weeks because we're still in March, but by early April. So if anyone's planning on putting manure on, if they could give us a heads up so we could go out and sample before that happens, it'd be super appreciated. We have one more round of sampling to do with the biomass. And I almost think we're taking one more soil health sample. So, and then on to the new is, and I don't know the details of this, and maybe Heather does at this point. We do have extra money left in the grant. So we're trying to work out a way. We don't have enough money to buy everyone's corn seed. That was a lot of money. But we do have money, and we're trying to figure out a way that we may be able to cover the cost of an herbicide program and maybe cover crop seed. I'm trying to get prices on cover crop seed, but the vendors haven't reached out back to me with anything concrete. And I think it's because they don't know. But I'm kind of we were around $50 a bag or $25 an acre. I'm figuring it's going to be more like $60 a bag, $30 an acre for the seed, not knowing. But so I don't know all the details of that because I don't know. The money wasn't allocated to this use, so UVM's got to do their acrobats with NRCS to try to yank money, switch money in the budget, and maybe that's been done. I'm not sure, but we're going to have some ability to assist the farmers that wish to continue for this 3rd and final year to some degree. And I think what will happen is when we get that hammered down, we'll send an email out and then really dial it in on exactly what those numbers will be per farm. So that's kind of what I have. I think that a bunch of smaller farms have voiced an interest in having UVM assist them one more year with the corn planting, and we are working on trying to figure out a way to do that as well. So that's kind of what I have, Heather. I don't know if we have more to add or can fill in any gaps I may have left. But that's where I'm at.
Well, as far as the budget goes, we're trying to figure that out. But it does seem likely that we'll have money to pay. We definitely will, if folks need help from Jeff, whether it's planting or interseeding, that time and resource will be available as far as what we can cover for seed, cover crop seed costs, or herbicide. Those are going to be the only two things that we think we'll be able to afford to cover through what's remaining in the grant. I'm kind of still working that out with the grants office. So I don't have a solid answer, but it definitely looks like we would be close to being able to cover. I'd like to be able to cover the herbicide so that we can get the field sprayed the way that we want them to be sprayed. And I would definitely like to cover the cost of the cover crop seed. And so that's what we're working on. But we definitely won't be able to cover the corn seed. There's just no way. And you know, as long as Jeff's able to, he would be available to help with corn planting and interseeding. So I guess at this point, we need to get back to you in the next week as we're working through the grants office to figure out, the money is there, it's just, can we transfer it from one spot to the other? I'm sure we all know, everybody knows about that. How do we make it available for what we want to do? So that's what we're trying to work on right now. And we have to get permission from NRCS to do that, from basically to move it from one category to another. And hopefully that won't be an issue now that we know what we have. And so we should be able to get a hold of people, you know, in the next week or so, with some final, numbers on that. I know everybody wants to get off, but there's been a lot of talk about inhibitors, and I just, and people have been asking, I showed this data at our FWA meeting, and that sort of spurred some people's interest in using inhibitors on hay fields. Let me see if I can get to the data here. And so if you need to get off, please, you know, obviously you can hop off. But over the last 2 years, in 2020 and 2021, we used an inhibitor on our fertilizer and also on our manure. And I will say that we put the inhibitor into the manure tank. We didn't mix it into the pit. And we broadcasted manure, or we injected it. And we broadcasted it with and without the inhibitor and injected it with and without the inhibitor. We also applied just commercial fertilizer, which was urea, with and without inhibitor. And then we had a control, which basically we just went over it and sprayed water. And we put inhibitor in the water so that we had that with and without inhibitor. So what I showed folks was this, which seemed quite phenomenal to me, that if we broadcasted manure with this nitrogen inhibitor in it, we got better yields than just broadcasting the manure by about a ton. And then there really wasn't any difference in yields. This is hay again, from injecting compared to using a broadcast with inhibitor. Now, so people are searching out inhibitors because of this. And the one thing I want to make clear is that not all inhibitors are the same. They do really different things in the soil. So we use Contans that we purchased from Bordeaux's, and it's labeled for use on fertilizer, and it's also labeled for use in manure. There's another product called Instinct that's available, and I will say it's different. It does an entirely different thing in the soil, and I will show you how they're different. Let's put that up there. Okay, so Contans, when we put it into the manure, what it does is it inhibits the production of the enzyme urease, okay, which means that it keeps the manure urea or urea fertilizer from breaking down, Okay, so it stays in this form right here. Okay, it stays in its initial form. In order for it to get broken down, you need water and you need a urease enzyme, which is in the soil. If you use a urease inhibitor, it keeps the urea from breaking down into ammonium, right? So this ammonium can also be volatilized as ammonia, and that's what we're trying to limit when we add a urease inhibitor, volatilization, right? So that's why Contans has a urease inhibitor in it. So it has this active ingredient called NBPT, all right? And then there's some other ones too. Here's some commercial names outside of Contans that are actual urease inhibitors. Now, Contans is registered for use in manure. I don't know about these other ones. I got this slide from Nebraska. Now, Instinct, you can see, does a totally different thing. And what that does is it keeps ammonium from being converted to nitrates. So that it does nothing for volatilization. And this is why on the label of Instinct, it says that you should incorporate it. Because these nitrous monas and nitrobacter are really down in the ground. So in order to minimize these bacteria, that's what Instinct does. It basically suppresses them, and it keeps these bacteria from converting the ammonium that comes from urea or urine and manure to moving to nitrates. So using these products limit leaching, right? And they limit denitrification, but they do not limit ammonium volatilization. So they're going to act different. And I know some people are looking for this. We just had this discussion with another group, Jeff. So I dug into this a little bit. So just, know what you're buying and what you're trying to do and like how you need to do it. So again, in manure, if you mix this into manure, it's really going to keep you from losing things to nitrates or nitrous oxide. All right. So just kind of putting that out there. More information not related to that project, but just thought I'd give you that since you're here. All right. I think I'm wrapped up, Jeff.
Yeah, no, I think everyone should get a copy of that slide and show it to the guy who's trying to sell them something and say, where does your product fit into this for what I'm trying to do? So I think that's a great slide for what's going on right now. So,
yes. Well, and it's not that having both wouldn't be really helpful, but if you're trying to limit volatilization on your hay fields, using a nitrification inhibitor isn't going to help you.
right.
Using a urease inhibitor will. If you're talking about corn and incorporating manure into cornfields and you're incorporating it, then yeah, I would use a nitrification inhibitor, not a urease inhibitor.
Yeah.
So you need to be thinking about that, as far as what inhibitor you're buying for what purpose. So just covering urea with an inhibitor may not give you the outcome that you want. And you might say, well, it didn't work. But so I'm happy to, you want to do it? Yeah, go ahead, Larry.
I just wanted to add on to that. We did talk to Bobby Starr, trying to get that into the FAP program in the state. NRCS does have that in there. Of course, it's too late to apply it for this year, but in the future, I was just talking to Sarah the other day about your study there, and then she said, "Oh, we do pay for that practice, but of course, it's past the deadline right now to apply for it. But going ahead, there is some payment because it'll cover the cost, and then And just looking at the slides that you had for someone like myself, if we're just broadcasting manure on top rather than injecting it in the ground, well, now I don't really need to buy an injector if it's going to be equal to if we can add this product in there.
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, the injector certainly can help with other things like runoff, you know, there's different, but as far as retaining nitrogen for your crop to use, yeah, I mean, these inhibitors seem to work just as well. And we have seen very similar results over the 2 years. So it's pretty consistent. But yeah, anyway, I know this is kind of a mystery to a lot of folks, but they do work. Inhibitors are proven to work with the active ingredients that are listed here. So that's the other important thing. There's a lot of stuff on the market, but if they don't include these particular active ingredients, they probably haven't, I'm not going to say they don't work, but I know these ingredients work. So not necessarily always the product name, but like nitropyrin is an active ingredient that is proven to work. NBPT, which is some long name, also proven to work. So, you know, you just want to be careful what you're buying. And there's more than these. These are just popular ones. Like I said, we use the Contans, but yeah.
So
Yeah, go ahead, Jeff.
I guess, I mean, I think that's great. And I think just in wrapping up, we're over time. Look for communication from us in the next week or so with ironing out the money part. And then, we'll be out to sample. We'll let you know when that gets closer that we'll be coming out. And if you're going to go do something on those fields, if you could just let us know so we could jump out there beforehand, that would be great. And if you need any particular help from our staff with relation to this, planting corn, interseed, whatever, I'll need to get on a list, and so we can figure out what we're doing, just the logistics, same as last year. So I guess if there's no more questions or any more comments, then I guess I would just end the meeting. And thank you all for taking time out of your day to join us.
Thank you.